All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I'm very excited to have as my guest today, Georgia King. Georgia, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Guy. It's good to meet you.
All right, so Georgia King, LCSW, is a psychotherapist who specializes in immigration law. Working with lawyers throughout Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., she's completed more than 90 clinical evaluations for immigration cases. As the director and founder of the Immigration Evaluation Training Center, Georgia is committed to helping therapists develop the skills and confidence they need to provide exceptional immigration evaluations. She's trained extensively with the advocacy group Physicians for Human Rights, and she regularly appears in court as an expert witness for asylum cases. She's also been a guest speaker at the Georgetown Law School, teaching law students about the impact of trauma on asylum seekers. Welcome. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and I say wow because this is the first time I've had anyone on who does this, who specializes in this. And with everything going on right now, I mean, I think this is so topical. But we'll get into that. First, before we get going here, Georgia, share with our listeners where you're from and where you're calling from, and then let's do it.
Sure. So I'm from Dallas, Texas, originally. I say the word y'all a lot. It's very cool word. I encourage you to adopt it. And I'm in Los Angeles now. I've lived a few places. Now I'm putting down roots here in Los Angeles.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's start out here. How so you're, as I said in the your biography, you're an LCSW. You're not a lawyer, or are you a lawyer as well?
No, I'm not a lawyer at all. No.
Okay, so let's start off. And share the journey of how you got here. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I never ever would have thought that I would end up where I am. I had never heard of anything about this. I'd never met a therapist who was involved with immigration law or immigration cases, nothing like that. I've worked with trauma in different capacities over the years in community mental health, and I also worked at a military base when I was in Washington, D.C. Really, the way I fell into this kind of by accident was I was starting my private practice. I specialize working with teenagers, so just completely unrelated. And I thought that would be my whole career, meeting one-on-one with teenagers. And then as life has it, I had to rent a new office, and it happened to be in this building owned by an immigration lawyer. So I sort of found myself in private practice across the hall from immigration lawyers. Wow. And they were the ones who introduced me to this work. And I'd never heard of it. It was really hard to find training. It terrified me. I mean, for a while, I just refused to get involved. In immigration world, they often call these psychological evaluations. And as someone who's a social worker, you hear the word psychological evaluation and you think psych testing. And obviously the stakes are so high. I wasn't wanting to, it was very intimidating. And I certainly didn't want to mess up anyone's life by getting involved and then finding out my credential wasn't eligible or that I was doing this wrong or something like that. So fortunately.
If I may just interject, you said they introduced you to this work. What do you mean by this work?
Okay, so just to kind of explain what it is that I do. So I get referrals from immigration lawyers, and the example that's kind of easiest for me to explain is asylum cases. So right now there's, of course, so many people who are seeking asylum. For someone seeking asylum, you have to prove that you were persecuted in your home country and that your life is in danger if you return. So it's up to the client and his lawyer, her lawyer, to prove this, that they've been through this persecution. And it's really hard to do because so often, even when someone's been persecuted, I work with Iranian people who've been thrown in jail, tortured by the government. They still don't often have physical scars. Or often perpetrators in that situation, they'll do things so that, specifically so that there are not physical scars left over. It's rare that someone has a police report or some kind of government record or photographs. It's rare that they have evidence for their case, really at all. So what I do and what therapists like me do, we come into the situation, we interview the immigrant, and we document the invisible scars, the psychological scars of trauma. And this is what helps provide evidence for their case. And the work is incredible. It's so powerful. So often, like I'm saying, there's no other evidence. So often this evaluation is really the deal breaker in the case. And I've heard this over and over from lawyers that they were not winning cases. Now they have my evaluations and they're winning these cases. And it's the most amazing feeling really ever.
No, that sounds really super intense. Okay, so thank you for clarifying that. So let's continue on here. So you're working across from these guys. They introduce you to the work, and what unfolds for you?
So as life has it, there's this group called Physicians for Human Rights, you mentioned in the bio there. They do several trainings a year on asylum cases, and they just happen to have this training coming to DC, around this time. And so I was able to train with them on how to do these asylum cases. So it was very scary getting started. It was very hard to find other therapists who were even doing this work. And I think I didn't really start to feel confident until I started hearing back that the cases were successful. And then it wasn't really until that started happening that I felt like, okay, I have the confidence to do this. I'm not just an imposter. And I feel, looking back, so grateful that I was able to kind of take, at the time, it was a pretty big leap for me to get involved in this world at all. And I feel really grateful that I was able to do that. I had experiences and people who helped me do that. And it's become the focus of my private practice, and really one of the things I'm most passionate about.
So just to be clear, so you're working, lawyers bring you cases?
Yes, exactly.
Right. So let's talk about the process a little, about what happens, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty of how you do your work.
The process as far as as far as the referrals, or
referrals, and what you do with it once you get a referral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So therapists do this all different kinds of ways. This is kind of like the Wild West, because there's no oversight to anything. So immigration world knows very little or nothing about our world, the clinical world, and then vice versa. So what I've learned over time, kind of at trial and error, I find that it's most useful for me to meet with the client 2 different times, about an hour and a half each time. And I do a few different things. I'm, doing these clinical interviews, documenting the psychosocial history, in particular documenting current signs of PTSD or other mental health issues. I administer several self-assessment scales that clients can do to report more specifically on their symptoms. I offer recommendations for the future. That part of the work is they're meeting with the client, these 2 different meetings, but then the bulk of the work is me working from home, me writing up this report. So the report itself is about, again, every therapist does it differently, but for me, it's about 15 to 18 pages, per case, and it covers everything that it needs to as far as these cases. And there's other details we won't have time to get into, but there's certain ways that only a therapist can do this. Like there's another regulation with asylum cases where the person has to apply for asylum within their first year of being here. And often that's not the case. So what we can do as therapists in this situation is we can document if there have been any mental health reasons, psychological reasons why it was hard for the client to do that. So there's lots of nuances that, kind of won't have time to get into, but we're able to really hit the major points. I feel really grateful that I had this kind of inside scoop by working so closely with these lawyers, because it gave me a sense of some of the details of these cases. And I find that the evaluations are very different than the ones that I do in a clinical setting, like at an agency or a private practice or something. I mean, the skill set's the same, but the application is very different, because I need to hit and focus on a lot of different things that I wouldn't normally in a clinical setting.
Talk more about that, the difference.
Part of how I approach it is thinking about kind of who is my audience in here. And my audience is going to be immigration lawyers, immigration judges. So I'm careful as far as, how I talk about things. I am careful to sort of put things in more of a layperson's language. I do a lot to, part of my goal with it is to humanize the client, because I think of it as, And of course, I'm doing that in a clinical setting too, but it's something that I'm putting extra emphasis on because I feel like, it's easy for a judge, it's easier at least to deport someone when it's just a name on a page.
Right.
But when they have this document that is describing them as this living, breathing individual, it's a lot harder. So this part of, I really give thought to how can I contact the empathy of the person who's reading this. And so it affects some of the questions that I ask and how I use quotes from the clients. And so those are kind of a few of the things that I think about.
I could see how this would interest and excite you, because it seems like it does draw on a variety of skill sets. You're talking about finding and uncovering and expressing the humanity in the client. Also, you've got this these variety of tools you're using with which to assess the individual. And then there's a clinical part of it. Then you're interfacing with the lawyers. So Georgia, one of my questions is, so who are you working for, the lawyers?
No, not exactly.
Okay.
No, the payment, like that part of it, is from the client directly. It's interesting though, because there is also this way that I'm coming in as an objective assessor to the situation. So in a way, I work for the client, they're the ones paying me, but they're not paying me to lie for them. They're not paying me to write a certain kind of evaluation for them. In a way, I don't work for either one. In a way, I'm coming at it as this objective assessor. So I'm not guaranteeing what it is that I'm going to provide for them as far as how much it'll help their case or not. That being said, this is virtually never an issue as far as people malingering. The issue is that there are so many people who are fleeing life-threatening situations and need asylum here in the U.S. That's the issue. The issue is not people making this stuff up.
Right.
These are people who have these really horrific trauma histories who badly need safety in the U.S.
So it would seem to me that an asylum seeker, how do they find you? I mean, that to me seems like it would require a certain knowledge and insight. And I need to find Georgia King, who worked. How do they find you?
So they find me through their lawyer. And
Okay.
This is a good time for me to say too that one of the things that's really remarkable about this kind of work is that you can apply it in so many different ways and work with so many different kinds of immigrants. So on the one side, I do pro bono work with this group, Physicians for Human Rights. So in that situation, they help me connect with an immigrant who's in need, who is in a really dire situation, doesn't have means to pay for a lawyer, doesn't have means to pay for a psychological evaluation. So that's one example of work that I'm going to do pro bono. Now, with immigration lawyers, it's a certain subset of immigrants, because these are folks who have the means to hire a lawyer, which of course not everyone does.
Right.
And then it's the lawyer who reviews their case and says, okay, in your case in particular, we really need one of these clinical assessments. Here's Georgia King, here's her information, so contact her. And so the work that I do it's interesting because it's with a large variety of immigrants from countries around the world, who have a lot of different backgrounds in terms of economic backgrounds, financial means. I work with a lot of folks from Iran, recently from China, Ethiopia, Armenia, Great Britain. So I work with folks from around the world, and some of these are folks who have an MBA or a PhD, or they're married to someone who has, one of these credentials and works as a financial planner, say.
Mm-hmm.
So it's working with folks who often don't have any face or voice in the culture. And so it's an interesting, I know I've learned a ton. And it's relevant too, as far as, any therapist who might be interested in pursuing training or pursuing doing this work, because it really provides, it can provide a real stability for private practice work, because you do have these very reliable referral sources from lawyers with folks who have the means to pay full fee for an assessment, and then you can balance that doing pro bono work with so many immigrants who are in really dire need.
always useful and helpful.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Georgia King. She's the director and founder of the Immigration Evaluation Training Center. And that's your website is, the URL is therapistimigrationtraining.com.
That's right. Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to talk about, I mean, this is really fascinating to me because it reminds me of when I was working with kids. And I don't know if I told you this before. I think I did. I was assessing kids with showing early signs of psychosis.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it tapped into a lot of the variety of different things that this sounds as well too. But so before we talk about like workshops and things that you offer, are you providing like therapy or treatment as well to these people, or is it what you're offering here very kind of separate and distinct?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's separate and distinct. That it's really, as I was saying before, it's important that I come in as this objective assessor. It's really compromised if it's a client that I'm doing therapy with.
Got it.
So, it's what the guidance that I've heard and that I give other clinicians is that, once their case is resolved, then that could be fine. That can take months and years even. More often, I'm providing resources to clients who maybe need or want therapy. So it's more me connecting them with resources where they can begin therapy, as they're going through the process. But my role is just the assessment itself.
Okay. And I think we have touched a little bit upon this, but why do you think, Georgia, I mean, this obviously lights you up. Why, why? Tell me, what's it tapping inside of you that's clicking all these boxes that it does for you?
Oh my goodness. Well, a couple things come to mind. My grandparents were social justice workers in Guatemala City for 20 some odd years through the 80s and 90s. And I had the chance as a kid to go down and visit them once when I was 12, another time when I was 20. And made a huge impact on me. I didn't realize at the time, especially the one when I was 12. My grandfather was very awake in a lot of ways, and he was careful to really point out so many of the dynamics going on that I wouldn't have known about otherwise, or wouldn't have known how to notice. So he was pointing out oppression, racism, white privilege, colonialism, from when I got off the plane. I mean, he was really, those were things that were important to him. I was living in a very sheltered, conservative family, so I hadn't had exposure to a lot of these things. And I think that, as I've gone through my journey as a person, as a therapist, I really have developed, as best I can, a commitment to social justice. And I have a lot of privilege in this situation. I have white privilege of having been born a U.S. citizen. I mean, until I started meeting with these immigrants, I never really thought about my privilege as a U.S. citizen. The fact that my family, my loved ones are U.S. citizens. I didn't earn this. This was somehow, this is how I was born. This is what I was born into. So to be able to try to be of some benefit in this situation, it's deeply meaningful. And I think that's really, really the groundwork of what this means to me and how this does light me up.
So kind of touching upon that privilege and being a U.S. citizen, how does that play out when you're meeting with someone? What does that look like, or how are you embodying that? Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, that's a great question. I think that I think in a way, I don't know if this is quite the word I'm looking for, but it's like I feel a sense, I don't know, this word comes to mind. I feel a sense of humility in having had the experiences, the opportunities that I've had. I feel gratitude of being able to do this work, an awareness that my lived experience is very, very different than this immigrant most times. And I try to bring a respect and also a curiosity to more deeply understand their experience in the world, especially with regards to trauma. rather than making assumptions based on privilege that I have and what my experiences may be, what my go-to place may be with certain situations.
One of the things that comes to mind is, you talked about the invisible scars, and I that really jumped out at me. For a lot of lay people, there. What do you mean invisible scar? What do you mean, uh, anxiety or depression or no? Come on, please. I don't. I mean, that's an extreme, but that's out there. How are you communicating this to judges who maybe more or less certainly be a little more savvy, but maybe not? How are you managing that and negotiating, navigating that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I've thought about and learned about a lot over time. Because the other part of this that I have the chance to do sometimes is I get to go to court for the case. There's a court component for these asylum cases. So I've been surprised how little judges and lawyers may know about mental health issues, PTSD especially. I found that there really is this psychoeducation piece of what it is that I'm doing, especially when it comes to the effects of trauma on memory. That's really one of the ways that I've been called into court and what I've been asked to address, because as clinicians, we know that trauma messes up memory. It affects somebody's thinking, their ability to recall events. It's hard to put things in chronological order. But for someone from the outside who doesn't know that, lawyers, judges, they'll look at a discrepancy in somebody's testimony and assume that they're lying about it. Mm. Oh, well, you said this date, in the written affidavit, but then on the stand you said this date. We know that means nothing. If anything, that could give evidence that they actually have PTSD. It's like that's part of it. That's part of how PTSD functions. But from the outside, I've found lawyers, judges, they're very into numbers matching up, dates matching up. And when there is something that doesn't match up, they're quick to go to, this person is lying. So that's been part of my role there, to do this psychoed piece and try to explain the best I can in layperson's terms what happens to memory, why this is not a sign of someone malingering. So that's one example of how I try to translate. Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm like, wow, I'd love to do this. Anyway, seriously, there's so many different elements to this that really gets me. All right. So what do you do? So you do this work. You also offer workshops, and who do you think, or is there like an ideal person who would eat this up, an ideal therapist or social worker, whatever? Who's that? Is there a person like that?
I mean, that's one of the things that's so exciting to me, is that there's not. I mean, there are certainly a number of clinicians who find their way to me because they are touched by this issue themselves, that they're part of this community in some way, as far as dealing with immigration issues in their own family community. That being said, the work is wide open for so many kinds of therapists to be doing it. You don't need to be bilingual. You don't need to have a PhD. You don't have to have some kind of specialized experience doing this. So that's
do you have to be a licensed therapist?
You have to be a licensed therapist. Yeah, you have to be independently licensed. And then some of the regulations depend a little bit state by state as far as which master's level clinicians can do this. Mostly it's wide open. LMFTs are doing these so successfully in California, Texas, Florida, lots of other places. LCSWs and psychologists are eligible in every state. Other master's level clinicians, I encourage them to ask their licensing board, talk to other clinicians in their area. Most often they're eligible, but it's good to check on that.
Okay.
Yeah, but you don't need to be bilingual. That's one of the questions that I'm not. I work with really amazing interpreters, and the work is, I think it's a lot easier and more accessible than people realize. I know I hear even just the term immigration law, and sounds like that would be very scary. Court, like, oh my gosh. You don't have to go to court if there's no subpoena process. It's not mandated. It's always optional. So I think that people don't always realize how accessible this is. This work is really accessible. So we're all watching the news. It's really horrific what's going on in our country in terms of immigration. And this is a way to do something. And it's the most amazing feeling. Like I'm saying, these evaluations, they're often the deal breaker in the case. This is what makes the difference. This is the difference between somebody being able to stay here versus being deported to horrific gang violence, horrific domestic abuse. I work with folks in the LGBTQ community who are coming from, being kidnapped, being tortured, seeing dead bodies in the street. These are folks who need asylum, and it's a chance to really be on the front lines of a process that helps save people's lives. It's one of the most amazing opportunities I think that there is in the field.
Oh. All right. So if people want to find out, learn more about this, what kind of workshops are you offering?
Yeah, so I've had more therapists ask me over the last several years, how to do these. So from there, it just organically, came about that I founded the Immigration Evaluation Training Center, and I offer a lot of live workshops, over the course of the year. I have 2 different workshops. One is for asylum cases, like I've been talking about. The other one is, this is something we don't have time to get into, but I also do a lot of cases that are called petitions for extreme hardship waivers. Doesn't really matter the details, but it helps families stay together. So that's the other core part of the cases that I work on. So someone can sign up for either workshop. They can do either one first. They can do them both in one day. I offer these all-day intensives, and I really do everything I can to help them be accessible to folks. So I do payment plans over time, whatever it takes to help therapists feel able to do this. And I hear really positive things about the return on the investment. I do a lot in the workshops to make them as practical as possible. So it comes with really detailed templates, sample assessments, interviewing questions, effective marketing tips. Like we really focus on everything somebody needs to hit the ground running.
Okay. And are these in person, online, or both, or what?
Mostly they're online through webinars over Zoom.
Oh, okay, cool.
I do periodically, though, offer an in-person option in Los Angeles. And I've had folks fly in from all over the country to do this, who want that in-person experience. And and that's special when I do those. Yeah, but they're
Awesome.
always offered over live webinar as well.
Okay. And I'll have those linked up at the show notes page at traumatherapistpodcast.com. Once again, I'm speaking with Georgia King. Wow, really cool. Her website is the Immigration Evaluation Training Center. So let's, before we close out here, I know usually I ask about a go-to book recommendation, but you were talking about other resources that you think might be helpful. What are those that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I wanted to mention again this group, Physicians for Human Rights. They do amazing work worldwide to document human rights abuses, and then they teach medical doctors and therapists how to document signs of trauma for asylum seekers. So again, that's Physicians for Human Rights. I'm kind of a groupie of theirs. I love what they're doing, and they have amazing resources on their site as well. So it's a great site to be connected with. And again, my website is Therapist Immigration Training. So that's how folks can find me.
Okay. Wow, Georgia, awesome. This was too short as a lot of times it is, but really fascinating. And again, with everything going on in the world, to see that you're doing this, and it's amazing work and inspiring work. And I'm glad there are people like you out there. I'm glad I get to talk to people like you out there. So thank you so much.
Guy, thank you. This was a delight. It's wonderful to talk to you.
All right. Take care.
You too.